The autumn light of Paris had a languid, secretive hue, as if the city were wrapped in its own perfume of fatigue and whispered gossip. Annie, seated near the window of her modest apartment on the Rue du Bac, let her fingers rest on the pages of a letter that still carried the faint scent of violets. It was from Claudine, elusive, bright Claudine, whose laughter once filled entire rooms and whose absence now left Annie's heart like an unstrung instrument. She remembered the countryside where they had first met, Claudine's impulsive movements, her disdain for convention, the boldness with which she challenged men and women alike. Paris, with its subtle decadence, had since swallowed her whole. Married life with Renaud, luxury balanced precariously on ennui. She could not help but wonder if her friend's charm could survive within the polished cage of domestic order. Around Annie, the city pulsed with restrained energy. The ticking of the clock, the muffled steps of neighbors, the faint rattle of a distant carriage. Yet within her mind, another world flickered, one in which the fields of Montigny still smelled of crushed time and Claudine's voice carried the laughter of youth itself. Annie's own husband, Alain, was often absent, occupied, indifferent, his love a polite ritual more than a living flame. Her thoughts increasingly drifted toward Claudine's letters, filled with a kind of serene resignation, an adult wisdom that frightened her. I have learned that happiness, when kept too tightly, fades like perfume on warm skin. That sentence stayed with Annie, repeating softly as evening fell. She felt the weight of her own complacency, the silence between herself and Alain. Claudine's departure, both physical and spiritual, had awakened in her something restless, something unnamed. She could almost see her friend's sharp smile reflected in the mirror, as if mocking her passivity. The world outside darkened, and in the shadowed room, Annie realized she was waiting. Not for Alain, not for Claudine's next letter, but for a shift in herself. The air carried that strange electric stillness that precedes an awakening. Claudine's letters came less frequently now, but each one struck Annie like a subtle perfume, rare, heady, fleeting. Claudine wrote of her villa in Saint-Tropez, of the sea that spoke in silver tongues, of her solitude that was neither bitter nor sweet. Annie devoured every line, sensing that behind Claudine's calm words was a fierce struggle, the taming of a once untamable soul. Meanwhile, Annie's own life unfolded in a pattern of quiet monotony. Alain's habits were immovable, his punctual return from work, his casual questions, his silent retreat into the evening newspaper. Yet she felt his growing impatience with her silences, her distracted gaze, her newfound habit of walking alone along the Seine at dusk. The city's reflections played upon the river, flickers of light trembling like half-buried memories. Annie, in those twilight wanderings, felt closer to Claudine than she ever had in person. She imagined her friend's voice in the wind, playful yet distant, urging her to feel more, dare more, live beyond decorum. One evening, she met a group of performers in Montparnasse, artists, dancers, violinists whose laughter seemed to echo Claudine's own. They spoke freely, without the armor of politeness that Alain demanded. One of them, Jean, a painter with charcoal-stained fingers, listened to Annie with a gentleness that both unsettled and consoled her. He saw something in her that Alain never had, the hidden pulse beneath her quietness. Through Jean's eyes, she began to rediscover her body, her voice, her hunger for life. Yet guilt shadowed her newfound awareness. At night, she dreamt of Claudine standing on a shore, watching the tide recede, not reproachful, but knowing. When Alain remarked one morning, "You've changed," Annie merely smiled. It was true. Something in her had begun to unfurl, a slow, inevitable movement toward freedom. Claudine's departure was no longer a loss. It had become a mirror. Annie was beginning, at last, to see herself clearly. The tension within Annie had ripened like fruit too long on the branch, fragrant, heavy, near to falling. Jean's presence had become her secret air, a quiet intoxication that fed her sense of being alive. When he touched her hand one evening, only briefly, it felt as though the entire world had tilted. But with awakening came cruelty, the cruelty of realizing how small her marriage had become, how brittle the promises that once seemed eternal. Elaine noticed her absences now, questioned her silences, his voice tinged with suspicion. Yet his jealousy was not born of love. It was a possessive habit, a need to preserve the illusion of order. One rainy afternoon, Annie found herself alone in the studio, surrounded by Jean's unfinished canvases, colors that breathed, shapes that yearned. He entered quietly, his gaze both tender and resolute. "You are not made for half-living. You belong to your own flame." For a moment, Annie saw herself reflected in the wet glass of the window, her hair damp, her eyes bright with fear and desire. The choice before her was not between two men, but between the woman she had become and the one she still pretended to be. Their kiss was inevitable, not an act of betrayal, but of recognition. It was brief, trembling, filled with the melancholy of something too true to last. In that instant, she felt both exalted and condemned. Later that night, alone again, she reread Claudine's last letter. "Do not fear change, Annie. It is not death, it is a shedding. What remains is real." Tears blurred the ink. The echo of Claudine's words merged with Jean's, and Annie knew the time for hesitation had passed. She would no longer live in the hushed corridors of endurance. The storm had already broken inside her. Days passed like pages turned by an unseen hand. Annie's confession came not in words, but in silence, the silence of departure. She packed lightly, as if weight itself were a form of deceit. The apartment, once filled with Elaine's tidy routines, now seemed to her a mausoleum of forgotten laughter. Outside, the Paris streets glistened after rain. She walked without haste, feeling the cobblestones beneath her shoes, the cool air pressing against her face. Her heart beat with a strange calm, not triumph, not regret, but clarity. At the station, she found a small envelope waiting at the post, Claudine's handwriting unmistakable. Inside, a single line. "When one begins to live for oneself, the world no longer seems a prison, but a garden." She smiled faintly. It was as if Claudine had foreseen this moment, the younger woman's need to follow her own unsteady path as Claudine herself once had. Annie traveled south to the very region Claudine had described in her letters, the Mediterranean's shimmering horizon, the olive trees whispering secrets to the wind. There she found Jean already settled, painting by the sea, his canvases drenched in light. Their reunion was gentle, unmarked by passion or drama. What lay between them now was understanding, a shared silence, rich and alive. But even in happiness, Annie sensed that freedom bore a price: solitude, the haunting memory of what she had left behind. Each evening, as the sun dissolved into gold and violet, she wrote in her journal. The words came slowly, like breath. She wrote, "I am not who I was, and yet in losing that self, I have found the quiet pulse of truth." Years later, Annie would think of that summer as a threshold, the season when her heart ceased to borrow its rhythm from others. Jean's presence, though constant, no longer defined her. She painted beside him, she walked alone, she lived without apology. Sometimes a letter from Claudine would arrive, brief, luminous, written in the confident hand of a woman who had finally reconciled with solitude. "Annie," she wrote once, We were always two sides of the same awakening. You carried my youth forward, I carried your future in return. The sea remained her confessor, tireless and tender. Annie would stand on the rocks at dawn, watching the sky brighten, that fragile moment between night and day when all things seem possible. She thought often of Elaine, not with bitterness, but with gratitude. He had been the mirror that showed her the prison she was meant to escape. Her reflection, now older, carried the serenity of someone who had shed illusion but kept wonder. Claudine's laughter still echoed faintly in her memory, not a ghost, but a melody of freedom. Life, she realized, was not a single narrative, but a series of departures. Claudine's from her marriage, hers from her own complacency. Each woman had chosen, at last, to belong only to herself. And so, at the break of another day, as the sun climbed over the rippling sea, Annie closed her eyes and breathed deeply. The air tasted of salt and wild thyme, the scent of both loss and renewal. She smiled, not because she had found happiness, but because she had found herself.